Hello, and welcome to a special episode of Smart Talk. It's that time of the year for Marxists everywhere, the anniversary of the Russian Revolution, where the Bolsheviks took state power, establishing the first worker state in history, one of the greatest acts of emancipation in human history, in fact. Now, the whole Marxist left pays tribute to this event. Usually it's done by going over the history or, finding lots of nice quotes or something else of that manner. We here at Smart Talk thought it would be nice to take a slightly different approach and discuss the key lessons of the Russian Revolution for the struggles of the oppressed today. So with me to do just this is Comrade Vincent, editor of Spartacist. Hello.
Hello, Mansa.
All right. So one of my favorite lines from Lenin is from Left-Wing Communism, where he's talking about how and why the Bolsheviks were able to take state power. He says, and I quote, "Would it not be better if the salutations addressed to the Soviets and the Bolsheviks were more frequently accompanied by a profound analysis of the reasons why the Bolsheviks have been able to build up the discipline needed by the revolutionary proletariat?" So I want to take this quote, the point that Lenin's making, as a starting point for our discussion, because we're in this period of a crisis of the left. In fact, that crisis it's not new, it's decades old. The landscape of the left is one where there's thousands of tiny groups, multiple different tendencies. In some countries, you still have mass communist parties, but in those countries, you wouldn't know that because the conditions for the masses are not amazing. So I want to have this crisis of the left as an important backdrop for our discussion, because while the Russian Revolution is a model for a lot of the left, I think in practice, the state of the left kind of begs the question. So I want to start by, asking, using that quote as our starting point, what were the conditions for the Bolshevik success? And I guess crucially, why is this our model?
Well, just on the second question, why is it our model? It's kind of simple. The Bolshevik Revolution is like the greatest revolution in certainly in the 20th century, but in human history probably. And it's the first time ever really that the working class, conscious of its task and led by a party, the Bolsheviks, was able to really sweep away the old order, the capitalist system, really free itself from the shackles of an imperialist war and the monarchy, feudalism in agriculture, and capitalist exploitation, and really create the dictatorship of the proletariat. James Buchanan, the founder of American Trotskyism, has this phrase how it's the Russian Revolution really it put flesh and blood on Marxism. Really, it really showed it in practice and was successful. It wasn't a failed attempt. It worked this time. So for every Marxist group, obviously, the Russian Revolution becomes the example that worked and to look to. Obviously, so that's kind of the point. And there's obviously a lot of account of the Russian Revolution. The other point that James Buchanan makes often is that we are partisan. We do not look at the Russian Revolution like we look at an insect under a lens or in like an impartial observer. No, we are partisan, because for us the Russian Revolution was the first step, or showed the way. It showed what kind of party does the working class needs. It showed what how can you conduct yourself in order to successfully bring the proletariat to power. So, and you are right also that although the Russian Revolution is so rich in lessons, and we've only picked a few for today, basically, if you study the Russian Revolution, you can probably find lessons for every single political question you might encounter today. It is vastly misunderstood by the left, obviously, or distorted in many ways, or not studied in a serious manner. But to continue on your second part, like what were the conditions of that led the Bolsheviks to be able to seize power? I think Left-Wing Communism is a very good book for that purpose, because Lenin tries to explain really patiently to people who only discovered the Bolsheviks in 1917 really what the Bolshevik went through. And there's a whole history of Bolshevism starting at least in 1903, going through various stages and various struggles, illegality, legality in the working class, in the peasantry, among women, Jews, etc., all sorts of questions. I think the first lesson I would like to highlight from the Russian Revolution, and which is obviously relevant to today, is what I think, or what we think in the Spartacist League, is the main lesson of Leninism which is that the construction of a revolutionary party requires fighting for a split from opportunism or social chauvinism or all forms of bourgeois ideology in the workers' movement. Now, let me, got to flesh this out a little bit. It might be a bit abstract. Usually people, when they think of Leninism, they think of, what is to be done? The Vanguard Party or democratic centralism.
Yeah, I was just going to say that one.
Yeah, like organizational forms. Yeah. But really, that's really a misconception, because Leninism as like a body of thinking, like an extension of Marxism, is really born during the First World War. And what you have in the First World War is that the mainstream socialist movement totally betrays the working class and supports its own rulers in the war. And Lenin sort of stands alone with a few other people saying that, no, we will not support our own rulers in the war. We will actually fight for internationalism, for turning the guns on both sides. This war is reactionary and we refuse to support either side. And basically what Lenin advocated was for real communists to fight within the communist movement against what he called the social chauvinists, which was really the dominant trend of the workers' movement. And Lenin really built his party in a constant and conscious struggle to separate itself from the most right-wing element of the socialist movement, those who promoted class collaboration rather than class struggle, those who promoted an alliance with the ruling class rather than a struggle against it and its overthrow. And that's really, I think, the lesson that's always downplayed when people talk of Lenin. If you read the writings of Lenin, starting in 1914, it's really his struggle is to refound really a new international based on an open break with what he calls social chauvinism. But basically today would be any sort of socialist which support NATO, which supports the US empire, which tries to dress it in nice colors. And that's really how Lenin was able to build the most, I think, important lesson for the building of the Bolshevik party. When you get into the revolution, you see this in practice. So in 1917, what's happening in Russia? You have World War I that's been raging for 3 years. A lot of poverty, a lot of hardship, obviously. And the revolution explodes in February as a sort of spontaneous uprising from the working class in Petrograd, particularly, and very quickly overthrows the Tsar. Russia was an absolute monarchy at the time, and they establish a republic. However, quickly what's going to happen is that the power falls on the lap of the liberal bourgeoisie. They were named the Cadet by then. And the whole history of the split between Bolsheviks and Mensheviks is tied in part to this question of the liberal bourgeoisie. The Mensheviks thought that you had to critically support the liberal bourgeoisie in order to advance the modernization of Russia and eventually reach socialism. And the Bolsheviks spent all those years actually fighting the liberal bourgeoisie, thinking that the liberal bourgeoisie in Russia was too weak or too impotent to achieve any kind of progressive role. And so what you have at the beginning of the revolution, you have a group, basically the majority of socialists, like the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries, who critically support the liberal bourgeoisie. And you have the Bolsheviks who stand apart by refusing to give this support based on that understanding. Now, there was a whole fight in the Bolshevik party, obviously, about that. Lenin, fought Stalin on this. But basically, it flowed from Lenin's understanding that you needed a split with opportunism. And opportunism in this case was those socialists who were ready to form a coalition with the liberal bourgeoisie.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to ask you to maybe just elaborate for some listeners who maybe aren't so familiar with some of the terminology or some of the, I guess, things we're taking for granted. I mean, coming from the point of view where I end up, what am I trying to say? For example, if you look at the Indian communist movement, right, it's dominated by the Stalinists, right, which in a very crude way, back in the day, historically, originally, was making a block with the liberal wing of the bourgeoisie against, the feudals and the colonials and whatever, abstractly. So, why is that? What's the basis for this view? Like when we're talking about Mensheviks, right? What leads them to arrive at this position?
Mm-hmm. Well, they often think that they start from the fact that the liberal wing of the bourgeoisie has a certain interest in the development of the country. development of some infrastructure, development of some internal market, the redistribution of some lands against the old feudal landowners. They do have a certain interest into this, and so they take that grain of truth and then conclude that the Revolutionary Party and the working class must ally itself with that wing of the bourgeoisie.
Right.
And then after we've achieved these modernization, we will split from the bourgeoisie and then fight for socialism against the bourgeoisie. And what the Russian Revolution reveals, however, is that throughout the month of February to October, basically it was the liberal bourgeoisie that was in power, with the support of a large number of socialists, of revolutionaries even. And really what it showed was that the liberal bourgeoisie, because it was so scared of the mobilization of the working class, because it was so scared of the mobilization of the peasantry as well, would always block any sort of progressive reform, actually, and would try to find support in the reaction, in the old order, among officers of the army, among reactionary forces, to try to put down actually the revolution, because they couldn't. The truth is that they couldn't contain the impulse of the masses, of the peasants, of the workers, for these aspirations, because they would be necessarily directed against them. So what the Russian Revolution really showed was how in countries like Russia, or most of what we call the third world today, the bourgeoisie, even though it has certain interest in the modernization of the country, because it is tied to private property, because they will, always think about their profit first, they cannot ally themselves with the working class and the peasantry. They can lean on it, they can have, but eventually they will have to repress these forces in order to maintain their class rule, because when the peasants want the land, necessarily that anger will extend itself to private property in general in the countryside often.
Exactly, because the question would be, well, why stop at just the land? Why not the factories as well, right?
Yeah. Exactly. But we've digressed a bit. We surely should come back on this question. But I guess the most important lessons of Leninism is to fight for a split. And I think the split with opportunism and with centrism as well, which we can get into in a minute. And I think when you look at the left today, most people who are Marxists, who celebrate the Russian Revolution, do not view their task in this way as Lenin posed it, I believe. When they see a social movement, when they see a revolt, whether it be a strike, whether it be a social movement of a particularly oppressed group, they do not view their task as fighting within this movement for a break with its bourgeois wing. Essentially, that's really all how Lenin viewed his task in every single movement in Russia, and particularly in the Russian Revolution. But that's not how leftists approach it today. If we take an example of a revolutionary situation recently, like in Bangladesh, so there was a huge uprising. What happened was a sort of liberal, NGO guy who took power with the massive support from the student. It was pretty obvious if you're a Marxist that this person is not going to, he's tied to foreign imperialism. He's not going to resolve any of the fundamental question facing this country. Yet there was really lacking a force on the left which would really wage a determined struggle against this government on the basis that it's a liberal government, and wage a struggle among the left and the working class movement for a political break with this representative of the liberal colonial bourgeoisie in a sense.
No, I think that's true, and I wonder if you can elaborate. What does it mean to fight for a break? Because there's countless examples, right? But what the left tends to do, you've, I guess, painted a picture of one side, which is kind of just cheer on the movements, right? We're seeing this right now, actually, when there's all these sort of revolts happening in the global south. It's like, the Gen Z revolution, without really giving a perspective for how to get there, except you need socialism. Now you got to fight for socialism. Now you got to fight for revolution. Okay, so there's a bit of a flip-flop. You just go, oh my God, there's big protests and uprisings, fight for revolution. But what does it mean to fight for a split? I guess I'm imagining somebody listening to this podcast. I mean, we as an organization or a tendency, we're known, I think, for saying break with liberalism, all over the place. What does that mean? Or I guess maybe another way to ask this is what does it mean to fight for a revolutionary pole within a movement? You're part of this movement, but you're fighting for a revolutionary perspective for that movement. You're trying to win people over to a certain perspective by showing that, well, the dominant perspective that it's being led by is not actually going to lead it to victory, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, again, the Russian Revolution is rich of history. So after the fall of the monarchy, you have this republic, this provisional government, and it's supported by large areas of leftists. There's a lot of illusions in it. A lot of people think that we can get, liberation, peace, bread through this government. And so the Bolsheviks, what they do, and Lenin insists on this a lot in left-wing communism, by the way, is that the masses must, through their own experience, realize that this government is rotten to the core and needs to be swept away. We can repeat it if we want, but we have to explain to the masses, and they have to realize it through their experience. And the action of the Bolsheviks party throughout February to October are really rich in tactics and calls that they raise. Basically, what they do is kind of simple. They take what the masses want, what they demand, put them forward. Here's how to achieve these demands, and make the masses, through these experience, through this struggle, realize that the main obstacle to this is the provisional government. So an example was the imperialist war. This new republic, a lot of people overthrew the Tsar because they were sick of World War I. They were sick of that savage butchery. The new government that comes to power is led by the liberal bourgeoisie, who itself wants to maintain good relations with the Britain, France, and the rest of the Entente, as they were called. So they continued the war. And so the problem with that was that all these socialists who were supporting the government were essentially discrediting themselves more and more because the government was pursuing the war. So the Bolsheviks' agitation among the soldiers, for example, among workers, was quite simple, was that, look, we need an end to this war. We need peace. Who's continuing the war is the provisional government. They renewed offensive, for example, in March against the will of the population. And so agitation among the soldiers, you could direct the will of peace if you direct it against the provisional government by really trying to emphasize you need to break with this government if you want peace. Another classic example was the call that they raised, expel the 10 capitalist minister. Mm-hmm. At some point in the revolution, there was the socialists who were supporting the government literally entered the government to really give a left facade to that government. And the Bolshevik raised a simple slogan, expel the 10 capitalist minister, that is, expel all the liberals and form a government made up only of socialists, which was supposedly the program of these socialists. And that call was very popular and taken up by masses and masses of workers because it expressed really what they wanted. They wanted a socialist government. They wanted to get rid of the capitalist ministers. However, the leaders of these socialist group were really scared of doing this because it meant explicitly breaking with the bourgeoisie. So what they were able to do is just through tactics and sometimes simple calls, explanation, and taking part of the various strikes and struggle, showing how any advancement, whether it was peace, whether it was bread, whether it was seizing the land, that's another huge question. The provisional government, which most socialists supported, always stood as an obstacle to their most basic aspirations. Now, maybe that's still a bit vague regarding to your question, but I think when we talk about a break with those politics, the task of Marxists is really the Bolshevik were right to emphasize that it's through experience that the masses are won. That's also one of the big lessons. But the task of the vanguard is to really distill and make as clear as possible to the masses what obstacles stand in the way of the advancement of their cause. And that's how today most Marxists, they do not think this way. Mm-hmm. Take any social movement, that happened, whether in the West or elsewhere. The left usually is there cheering, or other ignore and stand by the sideline, but no one actively intervenes in the movement. Here's what it needs to be built. Here's what it needs to advance. And then through this process, making people realize that, maybe if we want to push this movement, we shouldn't be in the coalition with liberals. We shouldn't be in a coalition with representatives of the bourgeoisie. That's what we did, for example, in a very modest matter, for example, in the Palestine movement, trying really to hammer how in Britain, Labourite politicians leading this movement were actually restraining it. In the US, Democratic Party representatives were really building this movement in a way compatible with the ruling class by trying to show, here's what the movement needs to do. Here's why it doesn't happen. I don't know if that's
No. I think I think that spells it out, and I absolutely agree with you in the sense that what really unites the left is that they don't address the obstacles, whether it's a strike. They see a type of protest or a type of revolt or something, and all they see is, okay, good, now we just have to push it forward. But you can only push that thing forward, for example, by showing how the trade union bureaucracy is holding back that strike from winning. I think the question of obstacles is one that's really something that the left does not deal with, and they think it's just by having good slogans that you're just gonna advance the struggle. But we're talking about impacting consciousness, right? So you have to really break workers or people from the kind of illusions they're under, those illusions that are propagated by the existing leaders, whether they're liberals or the Labour Party or the Democratic Party or whoever. You have to really take on those illusions and show in the course of the experience why that's actually going to undermine their struggle. So I appreciate you laying that out. Okay, so in summary, I guess lesson 1 is you can only build a revolutionary party in the course of a struggle against opportunism and a split with opportunism and social chauvinism. You had mentioned centrism in this as part of this explanation. I just wondered if you want to say something about that.
Yeah, I didn't get into it. Centrism is just, it's revolutionary in word, reformist in action. So it's those people who talk good, but then don't actually draw the practical conclusion in their in their daily activity. During the time of the Russian Revolution, these were people like Kalkatsky, leaders, the main leaders of the mainstream socialist movement, but it's sort of left wing, which were saying all the good stuff about revolution, about against the war, etc., but remain in the main party, remain in the same party, as those who supported the war. For example, nowadays there's many centrists. If we take Palestine again, there were many people like a group like Le Voice or even the RCI. They could talk about how the Democratic Party or even Labourism were problems in the Palestine movement, but then none of their intervention or none of their slogans, or they did not make really their main intervention in the movement as seeking to advance it by pushing for a break in it, a sort of split in it. That would be good examples of centrism, I believe.
Yeah. Okay. I mean.
And by the way, just on a quick point, we're known as always talking about break with liberalism. One of the ways we came up with this, it's not only by studying the last 30 years, which obviously we did and it informed us, but it's also at looking at Lenin. When you read Lenin after 1914, he focuses a lot on the social chauvinists. But if you read Lenin before that, all throughout the 1900s, up until the war, his main struggle is against liberalism, actually. A lot of his collected work is directed at Russian liberals who were sort of the mainstream force opposing Tsarism. And he has a lot, actually, of really great writing, which I think often really applies about how the liberals, basing themselves on all these good principles, actually betrayed a struggle at every turn. And he also attacked a lot of the socialists who oriented towards those liberals, like the Mensheviks. And I think that's a lot of the problems on the left, certainly in the Western world, but more broadly than that. A lot of the left in the post-Soviet period has really become a mesh with liberals. That's what needs to be untangled, you see?
Yeah, for sure. Okay. So coming to the next point.
Yeah.
We want to talk about the democratic questions and the role they played. It was really a motor force for the Russian Revolution. So maybe you want to take that away? That's one of the key lessons as well.
Yeah, the second lesson I picked was for communist leadership of the democratic struggle. The Bolshevik Party came to power in Russia, but Russia at that time, 10% of the population was the working class only. It was a sea of peasants, as Trotsky says, the peasantry. So very little workers. And also, Russia was a prison house of peoples, as Lenin called it. That is, 43% of the population was Russian as an ethnicity, and the rest were of other nations and peoples, Ukrainian, Poles, Baltic peoples, Central Asia, Muslims, etc., etc. So the majority of the population in the Russian Empire wasn't Russian. And so here you have the Bolshevik parties who are based mainly in the working class, which is a tiny minority of the population. The only way they can reach power is by winning over huge layers and the majority of a non-working class, non-proletarian, and also non-Russian population. That was a massive challenge. And really, the Bolshevik experience is rich in terms of seeking to, obviously, to win the proletariat, but also to win these other layers and to deal with these other complex questions. The peasantry is obviously, is obviously one of the key one. The reason why this is important is because there's so many countries today who have still a huge and a large peasantry, and the Russian Revolution can really tell us how to do it. And really, it's kind of simple in a sense. Is to fight for the alliance between the working class and the peasantry. Now, okay, that's simple, but it's a little more. It gets a little more concrete when you look at how the Bolshevik did this. Really, it's kind of linked to the first point I made in a sense. What did the peasants wanted in Russia? They wanted the land. They wanted the end of like the remnants of feudalism. They wanted their own plots of land, which were held by huge landowners, remnants of the feudal times. And it was kind of simple to solve the question in a sense. You needed a massive program of land redistribution. The problem is the provisional government didn't want it to do this because obviously it was linked to the bourgeoisie, the liberal bourgeoisie in towns felt much closer to the landowners than to the landless peasants. Mm-hmm. And they were worried that an eruption, a peasant war essentially in the countryside would inevitably be directed against them as well. And basically the innovation of Bolshevik was sort of simple, was that let's not wait for the liberal bourgeoisie. The peasants should take the land, should take what's theirs. And actually they will get it the best with a government of the working class, is a government based on the Soviets and not merely in an alliance with the liberal bourgeoisie. So throughout the revolution, the Bolshevik tried to increase their influence in the countryside. And the easy way to do this was to take their demand. As I said, you want the land? Well, we have a way to seize it, essentially. Take it over yourself, organize committees, and let's put a government in the cities that will actually, rubber stamp this action. So basically, the Bolsheviks had really to build this alliance between the working class and the peasantry. And they could do so really, the shared interest that they had in common was really the same obstacle, which was preventing workers to emancipate themselves, to having the reduction in their working hours, to having better wages, who was pursuing the war, was also the same obstacle which was preventing peasants seizing the land. The liberal bourgeoisie was obviously against peasants roaming the countryside, hanging landlords, taking over their own land, burning mansions, obviously. And they did everything they could to prevent this. And basically, what the Russian Revolution showed was how the war in the countryside, while in the past in Europe it might have been used by the bourgeoisie to gain power against the old monarchies, in the 20th century, it was actually pushing them towards reaction. That's what Trotsky explains, for example, in a quote from the History of the Russian Revolution, which is a great book that everyone I think should read. He explained how the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries of Russian history climbed up on the shoulders of the 20th and bent it to the ground. The weakness of this belated bourgeois revolution was manifested in the fact that the peasant war did not urge the bourgeois revolutionists forward, but threw them back conclusively into the camp of reaction. So that is that the question of solving the agrarian problem, of mobilizing the peasants, was not propelling the big bourgeois forward, was not helping them. They were actually scared of it. Mm-hmm. And then Trotsky goes on saying Tsereteli, which was a Menshevik, so a representative of these socialist groups supporting or part of the government, Tsereteli, the hard labor convict of yesterday, defended the estates of the landlords against anarchy. The peasant revolution, thus rejected by the bourgeoisie, joined hands with the industrial proletariat. In this way, the 20th century not only got free of those past centuries hanging upon it, but climbed up on their shoulders to a new historic level. In order that the peasant might clear and fence his land, the workers had to stand at the head of the state. That is the simplest formula for the October Revolution. And it's really what took place on a gigantic scale was this convergence of interest between the peasantry, or at least the poor section of the peasantry, which was the majority, and really the industrial proletariat. both have an interest in overthrowing this rotten government, which was really blocking their joint emancipation. And the simplest key to do it was to not do like Tsereteli was doing. That is, defending the estates of the landlords against anarchy, but really propel forward the movement of the peasantry, also trying to organize it, trying to put some order in the anarchy, but keeping the radical content of the agrarian reform. And that's really what the Bolsheviks were able to do. So the reason why I'm harping back on this is, maybe in the West it's not so much a question, the peasantry, but in multiple countries like India, for example, it's a huge question for the revolution, or Mexico, or multiple countries who are oppressed today by imperialism. You have a huge mass of peasants which need to be won over to the side of the revolution, or else they'll be used by the bourgeoisie against it. And I think when it comes to the peasantry, because the peasantry is not like the working class, they want their own little plot of land. They're not hostile to the private property per se. A lot of Marxists historically have dismissed this question as, among other, of democratic question, as like, oh, this is bourgeois stuff. You
they
work for
private property.
Yeah, they want private property. We are for proletarian revolution and socialism. We don't have anything to do with this. Well, the Bolshevik would have never taken power if they had such a conception. And really, how they resolved it was simple: was that we will take your democratic demands, but which are not per se socialist, but we will show to you that you need workers' power to get them. That's what they did. The Bolshevik Party, they took power and they implemented the program of the socialist revolutionaries. That was another party. Sorry, I'm introducing might be confusing, but that was the party of the peasants in Russia, and it was sort of a bourgeois democratic agrarian program. It wasn't like the collectivization of land; it was just a breakup of the big landholding families and the distribution of the land. Their call was basically, "We'll do the program that these people don't want to do because they support the provisional government," and the peasantry took the deal essentially.
As you were talking, it really reminded me, I think this was over a decade ago now, in India and West Bengal at the time, ruled by the communist government. They had this whole massacre happen, Nandigram, which was when, I believe, Tata, which is like a huge industrial, it's a car manufacturer, but also, they've got their hands in everything.
Yeah.
But basically, it's a situation you have, which is absolutely disgusting, where a communist government is trying to displace a bunch of peasants to bring in, investment, quote, to bring in jobs. But at the expense of the peasantry, and they do so by unleashing the cops on them and murdering like a huge number of people. So it's just a, sorry, this is maybe a bit random. It's just a huge contrast to the actual model that you're laying out in terms of the need to win over the peasantry. But when you have this like sort of warped conception of like, okay, well, first we got to work together to develop a given place, bring in capitalism, industrialize it, do it in an alliance with the bourgeoisie, then, kick out the peasants, who cares where they go. Like this is really the way to spread hatred for communists. And what happened in West Bengal is, well, they got ousted soon after that. So anyways, this is maybe a bit from afar, but it's immediately what made me think of the whole question of like the democratic tasks. I think ultimately the other thing that made me think of is this is really the question of permanent revolution, right?
Yeah,
that
exactly.
You can only you need workers' power to resolve democratic questions in countries of belated capitalist development. I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about Trotsky and like that whole conception, because that's really at the heart of like permanent revolution is the Russian Revolution,
Yeah.
As it played out. Now there's all kinds of very stupid and rigid understandings of what Trotskyism is. There's all these we don't need to get into like what the Maoists and the Stalinists think of the Trots, so to speak. But like, I think to really spell out the fact that the Russian Revolution is what Trotsky codified in his like whole theory of the permanent revolution, which is the basic point. Really is quite simple, which is you need working class, like, to be at the head of the democratic tasks, and you need like workers' power to resolve those democratic tasks. And I think the way you laid out the peasant question is an example of that.
Yeah, it's as simple as that. The Russian Revolution was the permanent revolution, exactly. And it's quite simple. It's just that these tasks, which were usually associated with the development of capitalism, like the agrarian reform, like democratic institution against like an absolute monarchy, or the nationalities as well, which was also a huge question in the Russian Revolution, like the right of self-determination for nationalities. These tasks cannot be carried out anymore by the bourgeoisie, because as a propertied class, it will always seek an alliance with imperialism, usually mainly today, against the working masses. And that for all these things, you need workers to power. And the reason why I think it's important is because the left today is mired in these various misconceptions about democratic questions. Either you have a lot of leftists who think that any sort of democratic question has nothing to do with socialism, so we ignore it. That you have the peasantry, but it's even more obvious, I think, on the national questions often. Oh, that's nationalist. We don't touch it. We're
What
for
do you mean?
socialism.
You want to create another state, another
Yeah,
country?
exactly,
Or against
exactly,
borders?
exactly. Meanwhile, the Russian Revolution shows that the Bolsheviks would have never taken power if they had not shown to the oppressed nationalities how they were the best fighters against their oppression,
Mm-hmm.
how under their rule their national rights would be respected, contrary to under the provisional government, which just recreated the old Tsarist Great Russian oppression. So
Mm-hmm.
you have these people who think we should just ignore democratic questions, or you have other people who reject the other part of the permanent revolution, which is working class leadership of the struggle. That you need not to accommodate to the bourgeois leaders of the peasant movement, of the national movement, of whatever democratic or social movement, but that you need to fight for the leadership of these movements. Show that only the revolutionary proletariat can satisfy actually these demands in reality.
Mm-hmm.
And you have these two trends often, which are both like false, have both been proven false by the Russian Revolution itself. Like in a sense, maybe I can read this quote. It's from the Permanent Revolution. The It's about the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry. Don't worry, it's not. It's okay if you don't really understand the slogan, but it's a nice quote because Trotsky explains a little bit what Lenin had in mind and what really was the Russian Revolution. He said the Bolshevik slogan of the democratic dictatorship was realized, in fact, not as a morphological threat, but as a very great historical reality. Only it was realized not before, but after October 1917. The peasant war, in the words of Marx, supported the dictatorship of the proletariat. The collaboration of the two classes was realized through October on a gigantic scale. At that time, every ignorant peasant grasped and felt, even without Lenin's commentaries, that the Bolshevik slogan had been given life, and Lenin himself estimated the October Revolution, its first stage, as the true realization of the democratic revolution, and by that also as the true, even if changed, embodiment of the strategic slogan of the Bolsheviks. And so you see how the October Revolution as the true realization of the democratic revolution.
Mm.
And I think that's, I don't know, that's quite strong.
Okay. All right. So second lesson, communist leadership of democratic tasks.
Yeah. And I could have spoken about the work of Bolshevik among Jews, among women, which are not per se democratic question, but really taking up the cause of the oppressed as the way to really win them over. But anyway,
No, you're absolutely right. Okay. Coming on to the next one. What's the next lesson that you want to talk about?
So obviously we haven't focused so much on the facts of the revolution so far. The Bolsheviks take power in October 1917. They gain a majority in the Soviets, which we haven't even talked so much about, but really which were the Council of Workers, of Peasants, and of Soldiers. So because they through their constant work of exposing the provisional government, of exposing those socialists who were supporting it, the masses really turned towards the Bolsheviks. And that's how really, as soon as they got the majority there, they dissolved the provisional government, seized really the key levers of power, and proclaimed the Soviet Republic, really the first worker state in history. Then they did face after that tremendous civil war, the forces of reaction, armed by 14 imperialist nations trying to crush the revolution, and by the willingness and the massive initiative spirit of the masses in Russia, not just Russian, actually other minorities. They were able to defeat what were called the White Guards and actually win in the civil war. However, the I think if we're going to talk about the Russian Revolution and how great it was, to liberate the peasants, to liberate oppressed nationalities, to really win over the working class, I do think we have to talk a little bit about why did it become what it was, Stalinism, workers' democracy was quickly abolished in the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess I just wanted to touch on why. And I guess my lesson, really, to give the punchline a little bit, is that the only way to defend a revolution is to extend it. That a revolution in one country, while great and excellent, must be only a first stage for a broader conflagration, a broader revolution that seeks really to defeat imperialism on the world scene. Let me just read that quick quote from Trotsky from the History of the Russian Revolution. He says that the different stages of a revolutionary process, certified by a change of parties in which the most extreme always supersedes the less, express the growing pressure to the left of the masses. That's what happened, throughout February to October. And then he adds, so long as the swing of the movement does not run into objective obstacles. When it does, there begins a reaction, disappointments of the different layers of the revolutionary class, growth of indifferentism, and therewith a strengthening of the position of the counter-revolutionary forces. And basically, that's in general what happened in Russia. The Soviet Union found itself absolutely impoverished after years of war and then civil war, and then found itself isolated. Lenin and Trotsky had really made the Russian Revolution as the first stage of the world revolution. And they had really fought as hard as they could to extend that revolution to Europe, particularly where they were looking, Germany in particular. And these efforts were in vain, actually, for reasons we're not going to get into. The communist parties were not strong enough there. And the Soviet Union confronted a series of objective obstacles, its poverty and its isolation. And from this is what created the conditions for like a layer of some of the most privileged section of that impoverished society to sort of seize reins of power and to really try to maintain their little privilege and turn the Soviet Union into not anymore a beacon for world revolution, but really an apparatus which could maintain their little privilege. And the head of that group was Joseph Stalin.
Right. Socialism in one country.
Yeah. So that theory of we're going to build socialism in one country is really just a theoretization of their position, that these people thought that we didn't need the world revolution. And the reason for that is, we can denounce them or whatever, but is because how they rationalized this was that, well, if we're going to be isolated, we have to make deals with imperialism. And if we're able to make some deals with imperialism, we'll be able to build our little socialism, except that deals with imperialism required like betraying the world revolution. Therefore, they embarked on a process where increasingly they sacrificed revolutions elsewhere. They used their influence to sacrifice the revolution outside of the Soviet Union for perceived short-term gains for the Soviet Union, weakening the entire world movement in thinking that we can strengthen our own position in the Soviet Union. And that's really what Stalinism essentially, and the difference between Trotskyism and Stalinism lies in this crucial extension of the revolution as the most important factor, honestly, in its defense.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a number of things that come to mind, like, I forget which book it is. Maybe it's The Revolution Betrayed. But, like Trotsky really takes Stalin to task with all these stats about like, oh, well, we're going to have socialism in like the next 5 years or the next 10 years and so on. And like really showing like the material backwardness of the productive forces, in the Soviet Union at the time and how that was not possible. I think the question I wanted you to address maybe a bit more directly is the question of Lenin and Trotsky looking to Germany. Germany was an advanced capitalist country. I believe at some point Lenin even says like he was willing to sacrifice, right, the revolution in Russia if Germany could be successful. I don't know if I'm making this up.
Yeah, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but I think he said something of the sort, yeah. Because he was really dedicated to bringing the revolution to Europe. He thought they wouldn't survive 5 minutes without it.
Yeah. And I guess like to explain really I guess what am I trying to get at? Like, why is it like? I guess my question is, why can't you have socialism in one country or something else that helps you to?
Yeah. Well, look, I think in the case of Russia, certainly, and most countries, uh, capitalism. What does capitalism does as a system is that it breaks down the barriers between borders. It creates a world economy, a world market where countries specialize in certain production process, and it creates a dependence between countries. That's actually a progressive feature of capitalism, historically speaking. You cannot have building socialism in one country implies that you're going to be reliant on your own little country, your own little productive process, and actually you can't. Marx, and when he talked about building socialism, he always had in mind the most advanced, industrialized, technologically developed societies, and even more developed than they were at his time. You cannot build socialism in a sea of backwardness. You cannot build socialism in socialized misery, in poverty. You need the most advanced technologies, the most advanced production processes to do that. And Russia didn't have it. It needed these technologies from Germany, from France, from Britain, from the US, essentially. It needed these technologies. So that's one reason. And the second reason, it's because socialism in one country implies that you're going to have a sort of lasting deal with imperialism, with the big imperialist power. We're going to do a little socialism. You're going to do your little capitalism, and everybody's going to be happy.
You have a peaceful coexistence model.
Exactly. Yeah. The peaceful coexistence with imperialism. The problem with peaceful coexistence with imperialism is that world imperialism doesn't coexist peacefully with socialism. It needs to crush any remnants of socialism because it's always viewed as a threat to its rule, ultimately. Mm-hmm. And so while all the Stalin and his successors would try to make everything they could to have a peaceful coexistence, and sometimes the US would pretend that they're for this, they would always conspire against the Soviet Union, obviously, until the United States, by tremendous financial and military pressure, was able to achieve its goal, destroy the Soviet Union in 91, 92, in what was a counter-revolution, rolling back the gains of October. And really, it's the policy of Stalinism as a system, so Stalin and everybody else that followed him essentially and agreed with his idea, more or less, of socialism in one country. It's really this politics that paved the way, that gave the space for the United States to really rearm, prepare itself, organize a really an offensive against the Soviet Union and go on the offensive, essentially.
Yeah, I think why this is really important today as a lesson of the Russian Revolution is China.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't want to get into the Chinese Revolution because that's a different type of revolution that happened. But, nonetheless, it ousted the capitalists. It got rid of private property, and it's what we call a deformed worker state. But, what the policy that the CPC, the Chinese Communist Party, pursues is one, essentially, of peaceful coexistence with imperialism. Yes. And you see that really with, forget like more historically, if you just look at what the approach of Xi Jinping is towards Trump, and they can spar a little bit with their trade negotiations, but they really want the status quo to remain as it is. Why? Because that's been the reason for why China has been able to industrialize and develop to the extent that it has. Yeah. But there's this illusion that, okay, well, now all of a sudden it's different. You can have socialism within China. Socialism with Chinese characteristics, etc. So I think why the whole point about internationalism and the degeneration of the Russian Revolution, right? The rise of Stalinism, its material basis, why that's really key is to understand the attitude that revolutionaries should have towards China, right? So even when the Russian Revolution got degenerated under Stalin, we continue to defend it, because it wasn't capitalist. It was still a worker state, there was no private property. We still defended it, but the perspective we had was to fight against the bureaucracy, right? The Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So I think it's to kind of bring that perspective.
Yeah, because we live in a time where it seems China is like amazingly developed. Like what do you mean? They're not like the Soviet Union. They have these.
Hmm.
They're the factory of the world. They're ahead of the U.S. in certain technological sectors, and the U.S. doesn't look very good. Like Trump, they have no, like, they've gotten rid of a lot of their industries. Now there's this trade war where everybody's saying that China kind of made the US back off, which has some truth, honestly. So why does this matter today? Well, it matters because although temporarily China might think they are winning against world imperialism, they are forgetting that the US remains a massive hegemon which control entire countries. And the US is positioning itself slowly but surely to try to encircle and choke China. And uh, and what China and what does China does in the face of this? There's this saying which summarizes a bit the thinking of Xi Jinping and the Communist Party bureaucracy. It is that uh, um, do nothing, win. So you just have to wait and look at the West sort of destroying itself, and we will just win.
Hmm.
And it's a real
That's
thing.
an
Like
actual saying.
well, it's like a meme, but it
Hmm.
summarizes a real thinking. Do nothing, win. It's a real thing. And that's the worst sort of thinking because the world imperialism is not doing nothing. They are trying with, various degrees of success, but nevertheless are trying to really encircle China, to position their card and to really put as much pressure as they can on the People's Republic of China. And I would remind also that in the 50s and 60s, a lot of people thought that the Soviet Union would overcome the US in a
Hmm.
matter of years, a decade maybe. It didn't happen because there are certain laws that remain. The bureaucracy remains an obstacle to this. When we say the bureaucracy is this sort of caste of privileged layer at the top of the worker state, remains really an obstacle to develop the productive forces and will sabotage world revolution to keep its credential for investors. So look at what China has. What did China do in the last few years to foster anti-US movements around the globe? Nothing.
Nothing.
Even worked against it. Whether it is Palestine, whether it is the various uprisings we've seen in various countries, they are careful not to do anything, and that
In
will
fact,
prove.
they want to present themselves as the best
Yes,
defenders of the international, rules based order and
exactly.
the laws and everything.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
that will prove fatal to them, just as it proved fatal to the bureaucracy of the Soviet Union, honestly.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
and so here's what's the point about the Russian Revolution is just that really what crippled the revolution was first its isolation, its poverty, and then the fact that a thin layer of privileged people took over and really abandoned really the perspective of world revolution. And so what's the conclusion that come from it? You touched on it, is that as Marxists we defend the Soviet Union, but we must defend those countries like China, but like Cuba as well, Vietnam, North Korea, which saw a social revolution, which although it wasn't, like 1917 was tremendously progressive, but the policies of these regimes is really an obstacle to their defense, is really sabotaging the regime itself internally, but also externally, essentially. And how it is key for Trotskyists to really defend those countries against imperialism. Like, think of how many communists today in the West defend China against the US. There are not
Well,
a lot.
a lot of them think it's imperialist.
A lot of them think it's imperialist. A lot of
Mm,
them think that the US really moving to asphyxiate China and China resisting is like, oh, these are two bad sides and we don't take a side
mm,
for communism. Well, it's really missing the entire, task of the era, which is to defend China. And the only way they'll get a hearing among the Chinese working class.
mhm,
But however, it requires also opposing this trend on the left, which think that Xi Jinping is, a socialist, which think that his policies are great because it covers up exactly what we talked about, sacrificing the world revolution for the narrow interest of a single country.
mhm.
That's not going to work long term.
Okay. I think that's an important point. I mean, I think the first two, how to build a party, the Revolutionary Party,
Yeah.
communist leadership of democratic struggles, those some, like, I guess, positive lessons of the Russian Revolution. And this one, unfortunately, in the negative,
Yeah.
right? How the revolution degenerated.
Hmm.
But nonetheless, I think it's essential to, as you said, for one of the crucial tasks of our era, which is China.
Yeah.
Okay. All
So
right.
we've touched on many points and so superficially, honestly. And I presume for some who know a lot, maybe it was a bit frustrating, but I think
It is what it is.
it is what it is. But I really want to encourage our reader, if you haven't read The History of the Russian Revolution by Trotsky, you have to read this book. And
It's on Audible also. You can listen to it.
yes, you can listen to it. Even if you're not a Trotskyist, even if you're not even a communist, just go get it, because I think it's one of the greatest historical book ever written, honestly,
Yeah.
in my opinion, because he really goes through in details the various stages of the revolution, the class dynamics, and really paints a vivid picture of this, this historic, act of emancipation. So it's my plug, really. Go read Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution. It also helps to take a bit of a distance from the chatter of the news, the hysteria, and the difficult times sometimes we're living, particularly for militants.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, I mean, I guess, how do we start to wrap this up? I'd like to maybe bring it back to the crisis of the left and how to go forward. Maybe what's our contribution? One of the tasks we set for ourselves in this period is we want to have as much debate in the left for the purposes of clarifying the problems and the tasks of the left for regroupments. I think this is one of those things where I think, as we sort of touched on at the outset, the lessons of the Russian Revolution, the first proper workers' revolution in history, they're not assimilated. By the way, I mean, maybe we're getting it wrong, but let's have that discussion. Let's have that discussion, right?
Yeah.
But for me, these are the conditions for the success of the Bolsheviks, right? How they were able to build a revolutionary party, how they were able to win over a huge mass of the population inside Russia,
Yeah.
and to basically take state power.
Yeah. I think I think they are not assimilated. They're not studied seriously often among the left. And also I think I come back to this point that we've touched on the first point, but like the left really being enmeshed with liberals or NGOs in the global south really does a disservice to it, because it also prevents you from really studying these lessons properly. Who were the Bolsheviks? When you look at Russia, the Bolsheviks were really this small party compared to the country, made up of the most steeled revolutionaries, the most like hardcore of them. The soldiers who would go on a mutiny and execute their officers. The workers who would, in munition factories, who would always be ready to go on strike, and they were really the most like hard and steel elements of Russian society, ready to go forward, and they had no time for liberals or a lot of the middle class stuff that we see sometimes on the left, or we see the left adapting itself to. And I think it's I don't know, studying the history of Bolshevism really puts things into perspective for you, and really helps to make you understand what kind of party is needed really to lead the working class to power. And then you look at what sort of parties a lot of left groups are building today, and you can see that there is, which doesn't mean, to just say, we don't care about them all, but which makes it even more important to fight within the left today for a break with, bourgeois influence in our movement, for a break with like the most pro-imperialist element and those who cover for them, to really, I don't know. I think that's part of defending these lessons, is to fight for them. You can't defend the lesson of the October Revolution just, by talking about history or whatever.
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
it's a question of struggle.
Okay. Do you want to plug very briefly, like a little bit of our own history on the question of the Soviet Union?
Yes, we've been very critical of our past if you followed us, since basically our founding. But one thing that the Spartacist League, the Spartacist tendency got right against really most of the left, or the entire left, was our staunch defense of the Soviet Union. And whatever weaknesses or whatever, we've had various episodes critical of our past or articles, but whatever you might think of the Spartacist League, from 1989 to 1991 and 92, our organization really threw all its resources into defending the Soviet Union against counter-revolution. Really tried, send comrades, sent money, move people there, try to make contacts, and really threw all our energy and resources into trying to stop capitalist counter-revolution, and trying really to turn the the turmoil around the collapse of the Soviet Union into a political revolution. It was very difficult against major odds, but we saw it as our duty. And so whatever you think of our tendency, I think this was really the test of the epoch. The whole 20th century was defined by the Soviet Union. And when it fell, we were really, I think, we really threw everything we had to defend it. And I think if you're in another group, it's important probably to look at what did your tendency did, and what did you guys do? Because revolutionary parties are tested in big historical tests, and that was one of them. And I'm quite proud about what the Spartacist tendency did at that point. Really, defended the Soviet Union, in the DDR in particular, in East Germany, but also in the Soviet Union itself, and in Russia itself, where one of our comrades died even.
Yeah. I mean, I think even to this day, even the younger people who weren't even around in 90, 91, 92, I mean, this is true for myself.
Yeah, myself too.
But, this is actually one of the huge appeals that the Spartacist tendency had for me when I first came around. That it shows a mettle of an organization.
Yes.
It's not just words. And I guess that goes back to the whole point about it's not just about unearthing recanting the words about what Lenin said and what Trotsky said and whatever, but it's about taking those lessons and fighting for them in the course of struggle today, whether that's defending the Soviet Union then, defending China today, or fighting for a split. Class independence. The working class cannot go forward if it is hampered by all kinds of alien ideologies that are not based on its own class interests. That's basic, simple lesson, I think.
Yeah. And I hope you can do an episode maybe with a comrade on our struggle in the DDR or in the Soviet Union, because there are great stories which shows how the October Revolution and its appeal really lived deeply, even after generation and generation of people there.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. But for us, it's not just an appeal, it's also a program with clear lessons. So
okay. Well, on that note, thank you for coming to explain these things to us.
Always a pleasure, Mansa.
Again, if you listen to this and your ears bled, please let us know, and then we can talk about what the lessons of the Russian Revolution are. I think it's much needed to have these kinds of discussions and debates. But hope you guys enjoyed this episode. On the DDR question, I've been trying to pester said comrade to do this episode, so hopefully it'll become a reality soon.
I hope so, because it's amazing history. Anyway.
Yeah. All right. So on that note, I'll say goodbye.
All right.
And thank you again.
Thanks.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.